Thank you. Good morning, everybody. If you were watching last night's debate, I hope you had your headache medicine. And I will refrain from making any overt political comments, except to say that my favorite comment from a columnist was in the New York Times this morning, and they said, "Who won the debate last night?" And the response was, "Everybody who did not watch it." I also liked the Facebook post that said the next moderator of the debate should be a woman with 4 kids who's been working from home and homeschooling them since March. And I will leave you with those thoughts this morning. So Oliver Twist, in this this section that I asked you to read, we're to the end of chapter 15. Oliver gets to London and we find him meeting up with this gang of thieves led by Fagin. And in this section particularly, Fagin's usually referred to as the Jew, lots of different adjectives about his appearance and how disgusting he is. So I do want to talk about the anti-Semitism, but I want to leave that for a later class when we have even more of Fagin, because there's a couple of other things I want to talk about before we get into this section. And one is kind of more serious. It's about sort of the living conditions of the time, but to amuse you, hopefully, before, it's really weird to say something that I think is going to hopefully be funny and then not hear anything. But I wanted to read you just a little section of an essay from the critic John Sutherland. We talked before about how Dickens is so great with names. Mr. Bumble, who bumbles his way through life. Mr. Sour, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry, who are truly sour. You know, the very, very unmaternal Mrs. Mann. And I don't think any of those are accidents. Dickens clearly thought about it. So names are, you know, something of a specialty of Dickens. In this essay, John Sutherland says, he said, a writer wants to know if I've noticed, and they're talking about the version of the book they have, if I've noticed that between the pages 102 and 135 of Oliver Twist, there are lots of references to Jack Dawkins, the Artful Dodger, and Charlie Bates. Bates is referred to variously as Mr. Charles Bates, Charlie Bates, Charlie, and most equivocally, Master Bates. Out of 28 references, he's called Master Bates 7 times. Dawkins, on the other hand, is called Jack Dawkins, John Dawkins, Dodger, Mr. Dawkins, but never Master Dawkins. Is Dickens having a joke at the expense of his readers, I wonder? Or is this just a figment of my own suspicious mind? So John Sutherland goes on to explain the old joke, the schoolboy joke. This is Mr. and Mrs. Bates and their son, Master Bates. So I hope you're all laughing at that. Sutherland goes on to say, other suspicious readers and some critics have wondered whether Dickens is making an off-color joke with Master Bates, or masturbates even. There is no doubt that Dickens obviously often uses embedded word association in the names of his characters. These are not in this book, but there are characters he has in other works, Mr. Murdstone and Myrtle. The French word merde in that means shit, and murder obviously is, thank you, I got a laugh, so thank you, Steph. I like that. I appreciate your laughing emoji. And so there's those word associations embedded in Myrtle and Murdstone. Sutherland notices that Uriah, the name Uriah Heep is a pretty odious character who appears in David Copperfield. He says that the word Uriah is defined in the dictionary as urine and urea. So we hear that word association every time we meet Uriah Heep. Likewise, the name Scrooge has the echo of screw, like he's going to screw you out of your money in that name. But Sutherland comes down on saying he doesn't think that Dickens intended it, although we will never know, which is, Dickens we may deduce, given that he's called his character Uriah Heep, when that is even very, very close to the word the word Uriah, by the way, as it appears in the dictionary, does not have the H on the end. So Sutherland concludes, Dickens we may deduce would not flinch from masturbates on grounds of taste, but the objection to its being deliberate is that the schoolboy joke, although current from time immemorial, would seem below the author of Oliver Twist. So whether or not he intends for us to hear masturbates every time we read these little sections, we will never truly know. There was a children's program called Captain Pugwash when I was a kid, and it was an animated cartoon about a pirate who had a crew of hapless sailors with him, and there was a sort of urban legend going on. It's not true apparently, but the urban legend was that the two sailors that he featured prominently in the show were called Masturbates and Seaman Stains. So, look, I mean, we can't lower the tone any further than the debate last night, so I'm just doing my best here. Okay, I'll pause there if anybody has any questions about schoolboy jokes.
I have no questions in the Q&A right now.
All right, thanks. Okay, moving on to slightly more serious stuff. We talked last week about the Poor Law and how that put people in workhouses and separated families and made life incredibly difficult. And that was the aim. The aim of the workhouses was to make sure that people thought that anything would be better than going in there. They actually suggested that they make them as prison-like as possible. And again, we find it hard, I think, with our modern day attitudes to look back and see what the people writing this legislation thought about it and put ourselves in their shoes, because their view was that the criminal classes, the poor, were always poor and always criminal, and they didn't work hard enough and didn't want to try to do anything, so that they should be treated as meanly as possible. And obviously we can't possibly imagine thinking that in this day and age. But Oliver escapes finally from the Sowerberries home, and we're going to go back to that as we read through the chapters together. We know he ends up in London, and he ends up in these slums basically in the East End of London, with this gang of pickpockets and thieves. So I'm reading bits. This is, I found a couple of resources. There's a good website called Victorian London, I think it's .org. And some of the history Victorian books that I have here, including Victorian London, with segments about how they lived. So I just want to read you some little bit of background information about these slums, what they were really like. I did go back and look. I was watching, if you go on YouTube, I think you can see the whole of the Oliver movie from 1968, but you can certainly see lots of clips. And I went back to look at the clip where Fagin and the boys teach Oliver how to pick a pocket or two. And, they are living in, it's grim and dirty and horrible and there's one point where I think Fagin puts sausages down on the table, and the Artful Dodger says, "Oh, these sausages are moldy." But you look at the rest of the scenes in the movie, and it's a sort of fairly sanitized London. I don't think there was much. One member commented last week that it's amazing that they made a musical out of sort of this grim tale, and so I think they had to obviously sanitize it a lot. There wouldn't have been much appetite for a movie that showed the real situation. But as great as the movie is, it isn't the real situation, and I just wanted to give you some background. Dickens is very well aware of these situations. He used to go walking late at night. Those of you who are in the Great Expectations class with me will know that he talked about, walking from sort of the far side of Essex almost into London, and how many miles that was, and saying that was nothing. And Dickens would walk, easily 10, 12 miles a day at times. He would go out at night, and he would go into the slum areas of London and see what he could see, and sometimes give money to poor people or help them if he could. And then he would write about it and would lobby for better conditions. He wrote, articles and letters and all sorts of things. And he followed closely correspondence that appeared, for example, in the Times, where people were talking about how the poor law had affected the people. There were workhouses in London, but as I said, people would avoid them and would do anything they possibly could to go in them. So instead of the workhouse, wherever they could find a little bit of shelter, a roof over their head, and just get by with whatever they could find to eat, they would do so. And so we ended up with these parts of London that were crowded with people, very, very poor and working people, just crowded together. So one historian says, at the beginning of the 19th century, the word slum was unknown. Instead, rookery was the usual word for overcrowded living conditions. As many rooks build their nests in a single tree, so a court is known by the name of the rookery, from there being a humble family in each room. Excuse me. That to rook had long meant cheat, added a moralistic note. Rookeries were where the dishonest and disreputable lived. The word slum emerged gradually during the late 1820s, gathering pace as did the growth of slums themselves. This growth was driven by the rapidly increasing numbers of London's inhabitants. Between 1800 and 1850, the population of England doubled. At the same time, agricultural work was giving way to advancing industrialization and factory labor. In 1801, 70% of the population lived in the country. 50 years later, this figure had been reduced to just 49%. Migration, particularly from Ireland during the famine years, resulted in the 18th century infrastructure of London being swamped by the huge mass of its 19th century residents. Transport, sanitation, food distribution, housing, none could cope with the numbers pouring into the capital each day. So they talk about the difference, that the historian talks about the difference between 18th century and 19th century London. And really in 18th century London, the poor people lived in the same areas as the rich people, in buildings behind the main houses, for example. But obviously as land gets more precious and scarce and more people come in, rents go up in good areas and poor people get squeezed out. So again, the article goes on, slums developed for a range of reasons. In some areas where speculative building had failed, huge houses were built for the prosperous who never came, put off by nearby piggeries and brick fields. the houses were then divided up into lodgings for the poor. So in other words, if you build a big house in a bad neighborhood, the rich won't buy it because they can find better conditions elsewhere, but the poor will stack it. And there were certain areas that just never really, for various reasons. There's an area now called Pimlico, which is right next to sort of where Victoria and Chelsea meet, and now it's considered very upscale, but back then it was very damp and prone to flooding. So guess who got to live in Pimlico? It wasn't the rich people. So there were geographical reasons as well, not just that people didn't want to live next to a piggery or to a brickyard, but also there were areas where without modern engineering, conditions were just never going to be very great. In terms of not understanding the root causes of poverty, and the believing that poor people were just indolent and good for nothing. This came out of this separation of people. One historian says, much of the middle class disdain for the poor was the result of incomprehension, owing to the increased separation of the classes. Previously, the rich and poor had lived in the same districts, the rich in the main streets, the poor in the service streets behind. As London expanded to meet the needs of the growing numbers of workers and residents in the city and the West End, the houses of the poor were demolished. Up to 25% of the houses for the poor vanished between 1830 and 1850 alone. The residents were forced into areas that were already slums or would soon become so through overcrowding, while the prosperous in turn moved out of the city centre and into the new suburbs. Now, of course, what we think of as suburbs now of London would have been very, very, very rural areas back then. What we think of now as the smart districts like Kensington and Belgravia and Chelsea, those would all have been suburbs back in the time of Dickens' writing. Again, they use the word court to describe this. The courts were sort of like buildings tucked away or off side streets, so that they were often back to back, best described as one historian says that the words rental courts were enough to identify a slum in 19th century London, meaning as they did housing built behind other buildings, using the passageway that had originally been designed to give access to stabling. So you can see that they're cramming living accommodations into places that was never designed to be. The entrance to Frying Pan Alley, one of Field Lane's nearly 36 courts, measured 2 feet 6 inches across, not wide enough to get a coffin through, exclaimed a scandalized reporter. 20 feet long, the court nevertheless contained 20 houses, with more courts beyond. Around those dead-end courtyards stood black and crumbling hovels, forming 3 sides of a miserable little square built against 3 walls, and so having windows on just one side. Sometimes behind these courts, more buildings were thrown up in what had been the yards of the houses opposite, buildings therefore with no windows at all. So you can imagine how delightful those became, with no sanitation and no electricity. They must have been just horrendous, stinking, dark, fetid places. But the idea that these were still better than the workhouse shows you just how bad the workhouses were viewed. People were not insensible to the conditions that people were living in, and they tried to improve the areas. They called it sometimes ventilating areas, which literally means, putting some air into spaces where there had not been spaces before, knocking down these buildings within buildings and other things like that. But of course, that's just not helpful, because the minute you ventilate, is the term that the Victorians often used, or improve an area, you're pricing the original residents out of this. There was no cheap and readily available public transport available in London at this time. So workers were forced to live within walking distance of their place of work. I have a statistic here, as late as 1900, so this is 60 years after we are discussing right now, 40% of Westminster residents were costers, hawkers, and cleaners living near their employment. Clearances, i.e. where areas have been improved and widened and buildings knocked down, simply increased crowding in nearby neighborhoods, turning them into slums in turn, or worsening their conditions if there were slums already. In 1841, which is around the time that Dickens was finishing up Oliver Twist, in Church Lane in St. Giles, 655 people were crammed into 27 houses. So the sheer scale of the press of bodies must have been almost unbearable. Hard to believe now. There's historian Judith Flanders, who's referenced Oliver Twist in one of her comments. When we get to Oliver living in Fagin's den of thieves, we find that Fagin gives him some water to wash his face with. And this historian Judith Flanders says, in Oliver Twist, Oliver washes himself and makes everything tidy by emptying the basin out of the window as directed by Fagin. This no doubt raised a smile in middle-class readers, but what else was Fagin to do in his slum? Few houses had any drainage, water supplies ranged from scarce to non-existent, and there were few privies. Privy, of course, being a toilet or bathroom. It was not what the residents wanted, but what the landlords supplied, and most inhabitants made efforts to keep their living quarters as clean as possible, giving them meager resources. Sometimes landlords let an elderly or infirm person have a bed, rarely a room, rent-free in return for washing down the privy daily. When the landlord made no such provision, the residents arranged for the most impoverished of them to take on the task. And as payment, the people what lives there gives her their cinders, their broken bits of coal. So if you lived there and you volunteered to clean the privy, you were rewarded with a few chips of coal to keep your fire going at night. No matter how clean the inhabitants may have wanted to be, it was a losing battle. In one alley behind Farringdon Street, as late as the 1860s, there was one privy for a court with 400 residents. Landlords who thought 400 people needed only one privy were not going to pay to have it emptied regularly. And that, apparently, that privy in the court behind Farringdon Street, people complained about it, so it was taken out and not replaced. So we can only imagine what conditions really were like for the people who lived in these situations. So I'm going to pause there.
And you do have a question.
I do. Sorry.
The information about why people in the 1840s were so judgmental about the poor was interesting. The historian you quoted said this incomprehension was fed by increased separation of wealthy and the poor. I wonder if the horrible anti-Semitism in this novel is in part a function of separate living quarters for Christians and Jews.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Kathy. I think that's very possibly true. You know, there's my cover photo on Facebook right now that says, I can't remember the exact word, but basically, you know, ignorance is the root of all prejudice. That, you know, prejudice is a I think it's an emotional commitment to ignorance. Ignorance drives everything, and if you're separated and you can't see anything, and if you're separated and you're happily middle class with, you know, a servant or two who comes in, who keeps your privy nice and clean for you, and you have clean bed linens and enough food on the table, it's not hard to see why you might be completely insensible, first of all, of how other people live, and to be astonished and uncomprehending about it. And I think you're quite right. The same might be said for Christians and Jews, because, there's always been a lot of bad information, that the Jews are just moneylenders, or the blood libel about them, cannibalizing little children and things like that. If you don't inquire and see and read and ask questions and find out these things, it's easy to see how you can continue to live in that kind of ignorance. And I think a lot of those people did. They just, they were told not to go into the bad parts of town, just in the same way that, I wouldn't go wandering around Southeast DC by myself right now. So, you're told not to go in there. And if you don't, read the Times, known as the Thunderer for its, fist-shaking editorials, if you didn't read those things, if you didn't see what was really happening, it's not like the TV cameras could go in there and show you on nightly news what was happening 2, 3, 4, 5 streets from your door. And I think the same is true for, ignorance of somebody else's real beliefs can begin to cause, hatred and prejudice for that. So good point.
Okay, next we have a question from Donna McCurdy.
Mm-hmm.
The word maze and labyrinth are used repeatedly to describe the city. What does Dickens suggest here with regard to the city as well as the story?
That's a good question, Donna. I think, we think of the phrase rats in a maze, has come out now. That's not something Dickens would have known, because this is sort of the, modern 20th and 21st century animal testing. But I think it is true that labyrinth and maze suggest that people are trapped, that there's no way out, that, there's nothing that you can do once you're in there. That is your lot in life. And it's kind of frightening. There's one point in this section where when Oliver's still with the Dawkins and Jack Dawkins and Charlie Bates, he's talking about, trying to find his way back to Fagin's if he possibly can. And it's central to the story too, because this is how Fagin's boys can survive. They know their way out of the labyrinth, not in the grand sense of, in the metaphorical sense of being able to escape the life, but in the very narrow sense of, if they're going to rob some rich old gentleman like Mr. Brownlow, they can escape, because they can dip in and out of these little alleys and streets and be gone before basically people even know they've been pickpocketed.
And one more, Mary Lou asks, are you familiar with the book Charles Dickens and the Street Children of London by Andre Warren? And she's just curious as to whether it was well done.
I'm not. I'm going to look it up. Thank you. Charles Dickens and the Street Children of London. Thank you for that, Mary Lou. All right. So many books on my desk. I'm trying to find mine. So we left poor Oliver Twist with the sour berries, and this is where we pick up his story in chapter 6. So we see Oliver make his begin to make his escape from the sour berries, and it comes with Noah Claypole, who will be back later in the book, by the way. Let's not forget Mr. Noah. Noah is just taunting Oliver, and of course, he kind of goes for the jugular by talking about Oliver's dead mother. And Oliver is a little boy for his age. He's not big and he's not strong, but he has that ferocity of emotion. I think all of us could understand that, if you go after something so very personal, and of course, in Oliver's mind, his mother has become a myth, an angel, dying, the minute she gave birth to him. And Oliver just can't hold back anymore. And however much bigger and well-fed Noah Claypole was, this is about, let me see, halfway through chapter 6. Noah's calling Oliver's mother a bad one. Crimson with fury, Oliver started up, overthrew the chair and table, seized Noah by the throat, shook him in the violence of his rage till his teeth chattered in his head, and collecting his whole force into one heavy blow, felled him to the ground. A minute ago, the boy had looked the quiet, mild, dejected creature that harsh treatment had made him, but his spirit was roused at last. The cruel insult to his dead mother had set his blood on fire. His breast heaved, his attitude was erect, his eye bright and vivid, his whole person changed as he stood glaring over the cowardly tormentor who now lay crouching at his feet and defied him with an energy he'd never known before. And we see what a coward Noah is, because Noah, instead of, picking himself up and realizing that he is much bigger than Oliver, starts crying, "He'll murder me." And the language is very important here, because "he'll murder me," blubbered Noah. The blubber, it makes it that much weaker on Noah Claypole's part. You can shout, "He'll murder me," angrily, or "He'll murder me," in a terrified way. But when Noah blubbers, we know that he's not really terrified. He's just being a coward about it, and he's just a weak man. So, there's always thought in every line about how things are done. And so then, of course, we see that Charlotte comes in to defend Noah, and so does Mrs. Sowerberry. And Charlotte calls him a little wretch. And we get a nice little mini pen portrait of Charlotte here, because Dickens says, "Charlotte, seizing Oliver with her utmost force, which was about equal to that of a moderately strong man and particularly good training. Oh, you little ungrateful, murderous, horrid villain." Between every syllable, Charlotte gave Oliver a blow with all her might, accompanying it with a scream for the benefit of society. So we can see that, Charlotte and Noah are clearly a delightful couple. And this brings Mrs. Sowerberry in, and Mrs. Sowerberry shuts him off in the coal cellar and tells Noah to go fetch Mr. Bumble, Mr. Sowerberry not being at home. But Mr. Bumble, she says, will, deal with him, and Noah goes off. And of course, we've come across the gentleman in the white waistcoat a couple of times in the workhouse board. He's the one who keeps saying Oliver is to be hanged. And of course, luck would have it that when Noah comes across Mr. Bumble at the workhouse, the gentleman with the white waistcoat is there, and he's now convinced that his predictions about Oliver are absolutely going to come true. Noah comes up to Mr. Bumble and says, Oliver has what interposed Mr. Bumble. This is the beginning of chapter 7. With a gleam of pleasure in his metallic eyes. Again, these little details that Dickens drops in for us. If his eyes are truly metallic, then they they're less than human. But he manages to still keep him on the side of human, but make him really mean with that gleam of pleasure, because Mr. Bumble is just waiting for something bad to befall poor Oliver. No, he's not run away, he's turned vicious, replied Noah. He tried to murder me, and then he tried to murder Charlotte, and then Mrs. And, obviously all poor Oliver did was kind of knock him over. But, here Noah is giving free rein to his, obviously, what are extensive acting talents. He should have been on the stage, I think. Noah writhed and twisted his body into an extensive variety of eel-like positions, thereby giving Mr. Bumble to understand from the violent and sanguinary onset of Oliver Twist, he sustained severe internal injury and damage, from which he was at that moment suffering the acutest torture. When Noah sees the effect this has on Bumble, he just kind of doubles down. And the gentleman in the white waistcoat is passing by, and the gentleman in the white waistcoat is just thrilled that, it's kind of like, I said it, I told you so, I knew all along. So he sends Mr. Bumble along to deal with Oliver. Mr. Bumble goes along, and Oliver is kicking at the cellar door. For all Mr. Bumble's, sort of grandeur and self-righteousness and self-satisfaction, he can't bring himself to open the door, because even he's now a little bit afraid of, Oliver and what he's going to do. And it's kind of ridiculous, because Mr. Bumble's a big guy and Oliver's this little. Mr. Bumble tells Mrs. Sowerberry she's given him too much meat, that it's your fault for basically feeding him. Eventually Oliver's let out, and Mr. Sowerberry comes home. And we have the sense that Mr. Sowerberry has previously been a little bit on Oliver's side. He certainly has, I think, appreciated the way in which, having Oliver there as a mute dressed in the black as a boy mourner has improved Mr. Sowerberry's business. But sort of, again, about 2/3 of the way through chapter 7, Mr. Sowerberry is caught between a rock and a hard place, because he has Oliver here bursting into tears. And although he'd like to be, I think, a little bit sympathetic to the boy, on the other hand, that's his wife. And Mrs. Sowerberry pulls the ultimate trump card and starts to cry. Mrs. Sowerberry burst into a flood of tears. This flood of tears left Sowerberry no alternative. If he'd hesitated for one instant to punish Oliver most severely, it must be quite clear to every experienced reader that he would have been, according to all precedents in disputes of matrimony established, a brute, an unnatural husband, an insulting creature, a base imitation of a man, and various other agreeable characters too numerous for recital within the limits of this chapter. To do him justice, he was, as far as his power went, and it was not very extensive, kindly disposed towards the boy, perhaps because it was in his interest to be so, perhaps because his wife disliked him. The flood of tears, however, left him no resource. So he at once gave him a drubbing, which satisfied even Mrs. Sowerberry herself, and rendered Mr. Bumble's subsequent application of the parochial cane rather unnecessary. For the rest of the day, he was shut up in the back kitchen in company with a pump and a slice of bread. And at night, Mrs. Sowerberry, after making various remarks outside the door, by no means complimentary to the memory of his mother, looked into the room, and amidst the jeers and pointings of Noah and Charlotte, ordered him upstairs to his dismal bed. So don't forget, Dickens is writing this before, I think before he himself got married or very early on, but it's a very astute observance that, you know, in any kind of marriage, if the husband wants a quiet life, he should not go against his wife's wishes, which I thought was a rather nice little touch. And this is where Oliver decides he's had enough and he's going to make a break. And he waits until the very, very first light of dawn, and he unlocks the doors. We learned earlier that it was his job to unlock the doors, and Noah Claypole was very upset with him for not doing his duty very early on. So nobody would think it amiss to hear him perhaps opening the doors. And he opens the doors and he starts running away. And he goes past Mrs. Mann's house, and there's another little very touching bit. You know, Dickens, don't forget these were weekly installments, and Dickens can, you know, within the space of a chapter, which was a whole installment, can make you sort of, you know, angry on behalf of Oliver that he's getting treated this way. He can make you laugh at the ridiculousness of the gentleman in the white waistcoat, and Noah Claypole's writhing around in his acting, and he makes you laugh with the idea that Mr. Sowerberry has to appease his wife. So we've been angry, we've been laughing, and now it's time for a little bit of heartfelt emotion. Dickens goes, Oliver goes past the house where Mrs. Mann keeps these children, and Oliver recognizes one of them, a little boy called Dick. And Oliver tells him, he says, I'm running away, I'm going to seek my fortune. And then Oliver says to Dick, how pale you are. I heard the doctor tell them I was dying, replied the child with a faint smile. I mean, it's heartrending. And, you know, if you were, you know, a nice middle class husband and wife sitting by the side of the fire reading this weekly installment, you know, it'd be hard to read this without having a tear in your eye, I think. So Dick says, no, you've got to go. And Oliver says, yes, I will say goodbye to you, replied Oliver. I shall see you again, Dick. I know I shall. You'll be well and happy. I hope so, replied the child, after I am dead, but not before. I know the doctor must be right, Oliver, because I dream so much of heaven and angels and kind faces that I never see when I am awake. Kiss me, said the child, climbing up the low gate and flinging his little arms around Oliver's neck. Goodbye, dear. God bless you. The blessing was from a young child's lips, but it was the first that Oliver had ever heard invoked upon his head. And through all the struggles and sufferings and troubles and changes of his afterlife, he never once forgot it. So we've gone through quite the gamut of emotions in that chapter. And I will pause there and see if anybody has any questions.
There was one question. Joe asked, what's a drubbing? And I typed the answer of beating.
Yes, thank you. I don't know how drubbing came to be beating, but yes, it just means that he boxed his ears and what have you.
And that was it.
Okay. So moving on. This next chapter is how Oliver leaves his everything he's ever known and makes his way to London. He's, you know, sleeping at
one more question if you want before you get started.
Sure.
It says, do you think each chapter can be viewed as a standalone short story?
That's very interesting. Not quite. I think some may. I think they're very episodic. I think that that chapter we just read can be the. I think you know. I think it's more like if you watch. My daughter was watching an old episode of The West Wing the other night, and each episode of that series, and it kind of doesn't matter if you don't know The West Wing, I think, because I think it applies to a lot of sort of drama series. Most episodes of a drama like that, a TV drama that lasts for an hour, are episodic and are one story in of themselves, with obviously plot lines that go backwards and forwards underlying it. But there are times when you really need to know what's gone on before, or what's who people are, to make sense of things. You know, previously on The West Wing, Charlie was dating the president's daughter and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of times in Dickens' work where you can take each chapter sort of like a microcosm, and then there are a lot of times where the chapters are not really stories in themselves, but are linking episodes.
Okay, we do have two more quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
Any significance to the name Noah? Is the name a foreshadowing of Oliver's journey?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Donna. I think when we talked about, Oliver meaning elfin warrior, I'm not sure Dickens would have known that. But Noah it's hard to imagine that Noah wasn't chosen for a reason. So I think there's possibly something to that. I mean, Dickens was not, particularly, he was not really religious, but he was certainly well versed in all, Christian writings. I think he would have intended that.
And someone asked, they say, I don't understand what they did with the handkerchiefs.
Oh, we'll get to the handkerchiefs. The handkerchiefs are stolen, and rich people had nice silk or linen handkerchiefs that could be resold. They were stolen by the boys, so we will get there. Okay, so this is, poor Oliver is sleeping at night, sleeping in the day and walking at night very often, sleeping into haystacks and walking and trying to keep out of the way of people. And he has nothing to eat apart from a couple of instances where people take pity on him. And then he meets Jack Dawkins. And Jack Dawkins is, this sort of little man boy dressed up in men's clothing that's way too big for him. Something that they beautifully redid in the movie, actually, in the way that he was dressed. And he helps Oliver. He buys him some food. And then Jack, is well befriending him. And you have to wonder what's kind of in it for Jack. And there's a couple of possibilities. One is, obviously, the most obvious is he thinks he can recruit him for Fagin's gang. But I think Jack's kindness to Oliver also has a lot to do with the fact that, Jack has obviously been in very much the same position as Oliver. And he doesn't, of course, call him Fagin and call him a gang, but he calls him an elderly gentleman, which hugely sort of euphemistic for the business that Fagin is in. But of course, this entices Oliver into thinking that maybe there's somebody who's going to be kind enough, to let him live there. And so Oliver's kind of like, okay, I'm in. I'll go for it. Jack Dawkins does let Oliver know that his nickname is the Artful Dodger, and he doesn't really inquire. And of course, he's known as the Artful Dodger for his ability to get away quickly from, the victim of his crimes. But this, of course, does not occur to Oliver at this point. But they eventually make their way into London, and we get this first glimpse of the London of Fagin and Bill Sikes, who we'll meet in a second. And this again is about 2/3 of the way, maybe 3/4 of the way through chapter 8. Although Oliver had enough to occupy his attention in keeping sight of his leader, because there are so many little, I mean, it's dark. The Artful Dodger doesn't want to go to London till after dark, because obviously he doesn't want to be seen by any policeman who might recognize him. And it's dark, and he's trying to, it's, you know, this labyrinth, this maze. Although Oliver had enough to occupy his attention in keeping sight of his leader, he could not help bestowing a few hasty glances on either side of the way as he passed along. A dirtier or more wretched place he'd never seen. And remember, this is a kid who's been in the workhouse. The street was very narrow and muddy, and the air was impregnated with filthy odors. There was a good many small shops, but their only stock in trade appeared to be heaps of children, who even at that time of night were crawling in and out the doors or screaming from the inside. The sole places that seemed to prosper amid the general blight of the place were the public houses, and in them the lowest orders of Irish were wrangling with might and main. Covered ways and yards, which here and there diverged from the main street, disclosed little knots of houses where drunken men and women were positively wallowing in the filth, and from several of the doorways, great ill-looking fellows were cautiously emerging, bound to all appearance on no very well-disposed or harmless errands. So we get just a little glimpse from a child's eye. He obviously doesn't understand everything he's seeing, but this is a combination of Dickens' observation reflected through a child's eyes. So anyway, he introduces Oliver to the elderly gentleman. And as Oliver walks into this sort of den of thieves, this is what he sees. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire. Deal table is just the cheapest couple of planks, basically nailed together, nothing more. There was a deal table before the fire upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter and a plate. In a frying pan which was on the fire and which was secured to the mantel shelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them with a toasting fork in his hand was a very old shriveled Jew, whose villainous looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and a clothes horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Several rough beds made of old sacks were huddled side by side on the floor, and seated around the table were 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits with the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded around their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew, and then turned around and grinned at Oliver, as did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand. "This is him, Fagin," said Jack Dawkins, "my friend, Oliver Twist." So this is Oliver's introduction to this company, and as I said again, as horrific as these conditions were, people prefer it to the workhouse. They certainly seem to actually have a bit more food there than they would have had in the workhouse. There's bread and butter and sausages. And they've got, you know, a roof over their heads and obviously a warm fire. The image of them sitting there with their spirits and pipes is you know, it's kind of heartrending from a 21st century point of view to think of these little boys having, you know, their childhood usurped this way. But, you know, it's also kind of funny, I guess. Anyway, any thoughts or... Oh, I will just talk about the handkerchiefs very briefly. So the handkerchiefs are stolen from people. And they talk at one point about them, having markings on and having them unpick the handkerchiefs and take off the markings. Very often, if you were wealthy and you could afford it, you'd have your handkerchief monogrammed, so that if you, pulled out your handkerchief in a busy place and dropped it or something, you would know that it was yours, or somebody else would know it was yours because it would have your monogram on it. You could identify it as your property. And obviously, people may have the same monogram, but these were all hand done. There was no machine monogramming at that time. So people could generally identify their own property in terms of their handkerchief by the monogram and the color of the stitching and the needlework of the person who'd done it. It was possibly, if you were only sort of middle class, that, your wife or daughter might have monogrammed it for you, or one of the servants. You might very well know who'd monogrammed this, and you would recognize the work. So Fagin has all these handkerchiefs stolen. The monogram was taken off. He teaches Oliver how to do that so that they are no longer identifiable. One white silk square looks very much like another if there's no monogram on it. And Oliver is taught to do that work. So that's what the handkerchiefs are. And Fagin makes a joke of it at the beginning, saying they're just, they're going for the wash. And Oliver is very naive at this point. He believes it. And we'll get to the comedy of Oliver thinking that basically the Artful Dodger and Charlie are in their manufacturing business at some level when they're bringing things back from their labors. What is something just to mark for the moment is that we see Fagin's secret cache of objects. He's hidden some things away, and this will become important later. He doesn't realize anybody's watching him. All the boys have gone out, and he thinks Oliver's still asleep, having been given warm gin the night before, which will probably send any little boy off to sleep. And when Fagin realizes that Oliver is awake, he says, "What are you watching me? What are you watching me for?" And Oliver says, "No. And Fagin says, "Did you see all the pretty things I have?" And Oliver says, "Yes." He said, "They're mine, Oliver, my little property, all I have to live on in my old age. The folks call me a miser, my dear, only a miser, that's all." Oliver thought the old gentleman must be a decided miser to live in such a dirty place with so many watchers, but thinking that perhaps his fondness for the Dodger and the other boys cost him a good deal of money, he only cast a deferential look at the Jew and asked if he might get up. So Fagin has putting a little bit by for his old age. Not quite an IRA, but there we go. Okay, I see we have a couple of questions, so I will pause there and take those.
Kathy comments, "It's painful to think that readers during Dickens' day thought they knew what a Jew was by looking at someone."
Yeah. Yes, very. Again, I don't know if you can see the picture. This is a colorized picture of one of the originals. This, of course, is Fagin, and it's not just the swarthy skin and this long gown. This is, but the hook nose as well. And, Fagin saying they call me a miser, stereotype of Jews being tight with money. Okay.
And John comments, asks, "Given Dickens' popularity, did his letters describing the horrible conditions have an effect to improve the situation?"
Yes, they did. That was one of the things. This book was the first one. It's only Dickens' second novel, and it was hugely popular. And between this and some of Dickens' journalistic essays and his letters, I mean, it was, a very steady drip, 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 but they did get a lot of attention, and people did use his letters and his articles and his books as a means to sort of try and prod people into more action. Unfortunately, as we saw, sometimes the action had at least unintended effects, or the wrong kind of effect, because this is like the situation where the court behind Farringdon Lane, which had one privy for 400 people. I don't think it was Dickens who reported that, but when people who were made aware of things by articles and stories by people like Dickens, and there were a lot of other reformers who wanted to see things done better. As I said, once that got brought to the authorities' attention, the authorities said, well, this can't be, very sanitary. Let's close it down. And they didn't replace it with anything. So sometimes it was kind of 3 steps forward and 4 steps back. But he did bring a lot of things to the public attention, absolutely. And he was taken very seriously.
And Terry Feldmeyer has a raised hand question if you want to deal with that. Okay, go ahead, Terry. Unmute yourself and ask.
Good morning, Kay. I have to take you back a couple of pages. When he first meets Dawkins and they start walking through, and he makes the reference to the mill and the beak. And I wasn't quite sure I got what he was meaning.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Why a beak's a magistrate when you walk by a beak. And then what mill? I didn't get the whole thing about the lowering and the raising of the mill and the workers.
There were treadmills worked by prisoners in British prisons.
Okay.
So, and it was just to generate either, some kind of, energy to drive a machine or something like that. But prisoners were put on the treadmill, not, to work out like Jane Fonda in the 1980s, but it was not for their benefit and their health that they were given the treadmill, but to power a simple machine, maybe in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the places like mills were put next to running water, and water power turned the water mill. When they didn't have running water, but they had, lots of bodies. They used lots of bodies.
Okay.
Yeah, the beak is the magistrate. We will see Oliver comes up before the beak. The magistrates' court still exists in Britain. It's the first court that anybody's ever taken to, even if you have been, a serial killer or been suspected of murdering hundreds of people. The very first place you go to is the magistrates for arraignment, and there they decide on whether you get bail or whether you get remanded into custody, so. They don't hear cases of any severity, but what they do hear is, not that they had traffic court back then, but here in this country we have like traffic court where you just go with, I got a parking ticket or this or that, or I was speeding, and you can go argue it, or you can, give a reason and see if the judge is feeling magnanimous that day. Magistrates in Britain handle that kind of crime, misdemeanors, not felonies, as it were. And magistrates are not lawyers. They are upright, upworthy citizens. They usually have a clerk of the court who is a lawyer, but they're usually not lawyers, although there are some lawyer magistrates in bigger cities now. But they deal with sort of the low-level offenses of pickpocket, whatever.
Okay. Glenn asked, was the original story released with the illustration?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
And when Oliver Twist first appeared in the serialized version, did his readers think his depiction of Fagin was offensive?
No, I don't think so. There may have been Jewish readers who thought it was offensive, but the notion in people's minds that, the Jews were the criminal classes was so firmly entrenched that a lot of people might have thought he was just literally drawing from life. There was no sort of notion of sensitivity to anti-Semitism back then, I don't think.
Is there a good annotated edition of the novel?
This one I have, Steph, is the Norton Critical edition. It has lots of annotations. It's also, the book is not this thick. It has the original illustrations, and it also has essays at the back, reviews from the time. excuse me, critical essays and essays on things like the Poor Law. And this is the Norton Critical Edition. If you can't find it, drop me an email and I will send you to the link to Amazon. I like it for the background information. For me, a lot of the notations on the bottom are superfluous because it's kind of British and I know that, but I also understand that for a lot of American readers, as incredibly well read as you all are, there are certain Britishisms that this does explain rather well. This is where we see the business with the handkerchiefs. Charlie produces handkerchiefs. He calls them wipes. You know, everything has its slang. Obviously, we know why handkerchiefs were wipes. And just before that, the Dodgers has produced 2 pocketbooks, one green and the other red. Not so heavy as they might be, said the Jew, after looking at the insides carefully, i.e. there's not much money in them, but pocketbook just, you know, being a wallet. But very neat, nicely made, ingenious workman, ain't he, Oliver? This starts the joke that this is what the Artful Dodger has been doing all day, is actually making these pocketbooks and not actually stealing them. And he says to Charlie, you've got these 4 handkerchiefs. He said, they're very good ones, very. You haven't marked them well, though, Charlie, so the marks shall be picked out with a needle. And again, it's a joke because Charlie hasn't marked them. The owners have put their monogram on them to claim them as their property. But this running joke continues that the boys who've stolen these are responsible for making them. And as I say, Oliver thinks that they're incredibly diligent. So they teach Oliver to take out the marks. And then, you know, eventually Oliver is allowed to go and watch Charlie and the Artful Dodger about their manufacturing business. And this is when sort of like the scales fall from his eyes and he realizes what it was really all about. They see Charlie and Jack rob the old gentleman. And this is, I'm getting fast because I'm conscious of the time and I want to get towards the beacon, Mr. Brownlow, but this is towards the end of chapter 10. In an instant, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and the Jew rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment with the blood so tingling through all his veins from terror that he felt as if he were in a burning fire. Then, confused and frightened, he took to his heels, not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet to the ground. So, you know, Oliver gives us Dickens gives us, you know, a very human and realistic picture here. This kid has just suddenly seen what's happening. He's naive, but he's not stupid. And, you know, he's had a tough life, but he's obviously essentially an honest, good boy. And his natural impulse is to run. This is also very important for the plot device because the elderly gentleman, whose name we then learn is Brownlow, sees him running, makes the natural connection that this is the thief. And he runs after him, calling "Stop Thief." And we have this lovely street comedy of "Stop thief, stop thief." The cry is taken up by 100 voices and everybody wants to join in the hunt. This is kind of like, you know, their amusement for the day. Eventually, of course, you know, Oliver is caught. The old gentleman who's been robbed, Mr. Brownlow, doesn't want to press charges at first, and he doesn't want the boy hurt, but nobody else has any sympathy for Oliver. They just want to see him caught. And meanwhile, we know that Jack Dawkins and Charlie Bates have, as soon as they saw people chasing after Oliver, their self-preservation instincts have kicked in sharpish, and they've gone off in the other direction. So then Oliver is brought before the magistrate, and as I said, he was probably, not a lawyer, just a citizen who dealt with these minor cases, pickpocketing, minor theft, minor assaults, drunken fights, that kind of thing. My annotated version of the book does say that the model for Magistrate Fang was the notoriously severe Hatton Garden magistrate Alan Stewart Lang, who presided at the very notorious Metropolitan Police Office at 54 Hatton Garden, referred to at the beginning of the chapter. Dickens went anonymously to observe him. Lang was soon dismissed from the bench, though the precipitating factors had no connection to his portrayal of him in Oliver Twist. So, like a lot of things in Dickens' work, there's based on real life and based on fact. And I'm going to skip over these. If you've got questions about anything we're skipping over in these chapters, just start typing them in as we go through, because I just want to get to the end of the section that I gave you to read for today, and then we can deal with anything else you want to ask. So what we find with this is Mr. Brownlow sees how Oliver is being treated, doesn't want to press charges. The bookseller eventually comes and says, it's not him, he wasn't guilty, I saw the whole thing. And, the magistrate's basically saying, well, why didn't you get here sooner? And the bookseller's like, well, I couldn't find anybody to watch the shop because everybody ran off to catch the thief. Mr. Brownlow realizes Oliver's very ill, and so he takes him to his house, and he has his servants look after him. And, poor Oliver has never had such sort of kindness before the doctor comes to see him. And there's a heartrending little bit halfway through chapter 12. And Oliver is just sort of coming out of this fever, and he's talking to Mrs. Bedwin, who is the kind lady who's looking after him, Mr. Brownlow's housekeeper, presumably. And he says, Mrs. Bedwin says, oh, what a grateful little dear it is, meaning Oliver. What would his mother feel if she'd sat by him as I have and could see him now? Perhaps she does see me, whispered Oliver, folding his hands together. Perhaps she has sat by me. I almost feel as if she had. That was the fever, my dear, said the old lady mildly. I suppose it was, replied Oliver, because heaven is a long way off and they are too happy there to come down to the bedside of a poor boy. But if she knew I was ill, she must have pitied me, even there, for she was very ill herself before she died. She can't know anything about me, though, added Oliver after a moment's silence. If she'd seen me hurt, it would have made her sorrowful, and her face has always looked sweet and happy when I have dreamed of it. And poor Mrs. Bedwin can't say anything because she's tears in her eyes, as we all must be at Oliver's sort of innocence and goodness there. So we hear on the one hand of, we meet, as I say, Bill Sykes, who's, he calls Fagin his fence. So, obviously Bill Sykes is really funding the operation and taking his cut from whatever the boys bring back. And he has this white dog with the red eyes. Don't know if we get the dog's name in this section. Certainly in the movie, they called it Bullseye, the white dog with the black thing over his eye. And Nancy and Bet. And Fagin and the boys, particularly, and of course now Bill Sykes gets involved, they're all terribly worried that Oliver's going to tell Mr. Brownlow and therefore the police about them, that, you know, they're the real thieves, and they're frightened for their own lives. So they want to find out where he's gone, and nobody wants to go asking about Oliver at the police station, because they don't want to do that. But they dress Nancy up in some stolen goods to make her look more respectable, and they send her off to find out where Oliver has gone. And she finds out it's a certain area of London, but she can't find out which house it is, because, you know, Oliver is such a ill boy that he's been kept inside for a while. Mark the the little section about the portrait of the lady that transfixes Oliver, that's taken away. And then we get to this little section with Mr. Brownlow and Mr. Grimwig. Another wonderful caricature of a person. He's there for a lot of comedy, but he keeps saying he'll be content to eat his own head. And, you know, this is a sort of tortured version of, why, if you do that, I'll eat my hat. Mr. Grimwig goes one further, but the wig part is important, because we hear, this was the handsome offer, I'll be content to eat my own head, with which Mr. Grimwig backed and confirmed nearly every assertion he made. And it was the most singular in his case, because even admitting for the sake of argument the possibility of scientific improvements even being ever brought to that pass, which will enable a gentleman to eat his own head in the event of him being so disposed, Mr. Grimwig's head was such a particularly large one that the most sanguine man alive could hardly entertain a hope of being able to get through it at a sitting, to put entirely out of the question a very thick coating of powder. So Grimwig by name, Grimwig by nature, I guess. Mr. Grimwig's feature in this is a plot device. When you start thinking about fiction, and if you start thinking about writing fiction, you'll hear the advice given to writers to show, not tell. And by having Mr. Grimwig cast doubt in Mr. Brownlow's mind about the honesty of Oliver, we're able to see, rather than be told, that Mr. Brownlow at first is vehemently in defense of Oliver, believing him to be a good boy. But Mr. Grimwig plants that suspicion in his mind that Oliver's a bad one. Mr. Brownlow gives Oliver some money and some books to take to the bookseller. He has to pay a bill at the bookseller, and some valuable books, we hear. And Mr. Grimwig is there to show us that there will be some doubt in Mr. Brownlow's mind. If Mr. Grimwig wasn't there, we'd have to hear Mr. Brownlow sort of say to himself, I wonder if the boy is really honest at all. And that would not be anywhere near as effective as having Mr. Brownlow sit there and with the watch on the table between him and Mr. Grimwig. Mr. Brownlow obviously waiting for Oliver to come back, and Mr. Grimwig, you know, sort of not wanting any harm to come to the boy, but also, you know, wanting to be right in his argument. Just a quick note about the money. He gives, Mr. Brownlow gives Oliver a £5 note to take to the booksellers and tells him how much change he can expect. According to one website, I think it's Measuring Worth, I found, in 1838, the purchasing power of £5 would be about £450 in today's money. So he's handed him a small fortune. So a single room in lodgings, a single room, not just a bed, but a single room in lodgings would cost a manual labor about £20 a year in 1838. So that's a quarter's rent that he's given Oliver 3 months rent for a single room, which is far above any of the imaginings of Fagin's gang or boys, way beyond the slums. And another comparison I found, your average housemaid would earn about £10 a year in 1838. So if you were a housemaid, Oliver has just been handed about the equivalent of 6 months of wages for you. So a big sum of money, and the increased tension therefore in, will he come back? Will he not come back? And we know that he is, he's snatched by Nancy, who claims him as her little brother, and taken away. And there's really nothing he can do about it. The very end of chapter 15, weak with recent illness, stupefied by the blows and the suddenness of the attack, terrified by the fierce growling of the dog and the brutality of the man, and overpowered by the conviction of the bystanders that he really was the hardened little wretch he was described to be, what could one poor child do? Darkness had set in. It was a low neighborhood. No help was near. Resistance was useless. In another moment, he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark, narrow courts and forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to wholly unintelligible. It was of little moment indeed whether they were intelligible or no, for there was nobody to care for them had they been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat perseveringly in the dark parlor with the watch between them. Darkness had set in, obviously, both literal and metaphorical here. Oliver is being sort of given a glimpse of what his life could have been, and to grow up in a kind and civil, loving household, and snatched away from him all of a sudden by the Jew, Bill Sykes, and masturbates, basically. So that's where we leave Oliver. We know his story is not an end. We're about a quarter of the way through the book, but I see we have questions.
Donna asked, the purchase of the books for Oliver seems to mean freedom from the crime that he had been accused of. Is Dickens trying to say that his novel will free many from the corruption of the society and the poor law?
That might be a bit of a stretch. I think Dickens would say education will free people, because Dickens grew up very poor, and it was education that saved him. So I'm not sure that he would say his book is the key, but I think education in a bigger sense is the key. Dickens did grow up very poor. He had a miserable childhood, and I think that there's a lot of Dickens' childhood in this book, a lot more in David Copperfield. But I think Dickens said that there is a way out if you work for it, but the way out is not manual labor. The way out is education.
Stephanie asks, is there class on Wednesday, October 14th?
There is no class on Wednesday, October 14th. There is a class next week. We are reading chapters 16 to 25. That is Wednesday, the 7th of October. I don't really know how it got to be October. That's wild. There is class next week. There is no class on the 14th. There was a conflict. This class on Oliver Twist was kind of pushed into some gaps left by other classes, because we had started planning for the fall long before everything went online. And there's a conflict on the 14th. So there will be class next week, and then there is a break of a week. So you can catch up with all your reading then. So if we have no more open questions, I thank you all. Thank you very much to Meg, and I will see you next week.